Chimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Chimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Chimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna.
Paleontology in the Great Library is heavily influenced by their own history. The Bolondicure word for paleontological eras, anajan, is the same term for a sequence of rulers in the same lineage, often translated by the Assembly into English as dynasty. The dynasties of Chimere do not reflect planet-wide ruling lineages. Rather, it is conveniently diagnosed as a period of time without harvests. As harvests occur when the portal deems its territory ecologically impoverished, usually as a result of some minor or major extinction event, these dynasties mean there are generally stability, and therefore the ecologically dominant megafauna are usually seen as analogous to the ruling families of the dynasties in Ptolemaic independent state history prior to imperial consolidation. Though some in the Assembly favor constructing their own names for different eras in Chimere's history, most default to translations of the Great Library Dynasty, in no small part because it makes translating loaned treatises and codices easier. Often, it ends up a bit mixed. For example, Tetros Anajang is a term used by the Great Library. It often best translates to Dynasty of the Strange Beasts, yet the Assembly usually translate this as the Permian Dynasty because of its therapsids of our late Permian era being the dominant megafauna. It actually most corresponds with our Triassic era, but because the dominant megafauna are descended from animals harvested in the Permian, this is the preferred translation. Sometimes, as is the case with today's topic, the English name is a more literal translation. This era is sometimes called the Fourth Mesozoic Dynasty, or the Campanian Dynasty, but most call it the Red Spring Dynasty from the Bolondicure Vashayanajang. The most famous formation of this era, northwest of the Empire, is predominantly red sand. It was a period of great humidity, a year-round spring. It was also an ecological instability not because of poor climate, as indeed the warm and wet climate was quite favorable to the dinosaurs dominant at the time, but because continental drift ending the last dynasty meant the known world was thrown into chaos as new harvests brought competition, which led to extinctions, and new harvests and new competition. It is called Red Spring with some poetry, as it is perceived as a violent era of instability, much like the Warring Clades period in the aftermath of the Tyrant Dynasty, but also for a practical description of the soils in this formation concluding the era. As many more familiar with geology can attest, red soil is generally associated with arid conditions, not humid. Why then is this most famous formation of this allegedly humid dynasty red? Foreshadowing is a literary device used to hint at events yet to come. Though the librarians called it Vashayanajang, it doesn't exactly qualify as a dynasty under the strict librarian definition of a 10 or more million year stretch without harvest. However, the librarians still call this a dynasty, just as they often call the period of time after the Warring Clades period Kapanajang, or the Anchored Dynasty, even though the time without harvest didn't even last a full 5 million years. Most in the Assembly restrict the Anchored period as the longest stretch between harvests in an effort to avoid confusion and abide the definition of lacking harvest. It is also for this reason that the Assembly called the subject of this week's episode the Red Spring period, or sometimes just the Red Spring. For 25 million years prior, the cardinals were the giant carcharodontosaurs and apex predators of the tropical continents. The next largest predators would be the Megaraptorans, Abelisaurids, and the occasional descendants of previous Jurassic dynasties. Now, there was an influx of giant theropods, meaning the cardinals suddenly had competition at almost every stage of life, not just childhood. Carcharodontosaurs were at this point extinct on Earth, but Gondwana's new cast of apex predators, the Megaraptorids and Abelisaurids, were large and formidable, easily competing with adolescent cardinals. The real problem, however, was the Albertosaurs and Daspletosaurs from Laurasia. These could reach an impressive 3 to 5 tons. Alone, not much of a threat to a 9-ton cardinal, but the issue seems to be that they often weren't alone. Several bone beds early in the Red Spring and Earth during the Campanian suggest Albertosaurs were social predators. They were also a lot more intelligent than the cardinals, putting these numbers to much more efficient use than the occasional mob formed by cardinals when necessity demanded the slaying of a giant. A large Albertosaur would be an easy kill even for an adolescent cardinal, but it is unlikely the Tyrannosaurs tried direct confrontation. It is generally considered outdated that Carcharodontosaurs of Earth were outcompeted by the more advanced Tyrannosaurs. Indeed, while bias in the fossil record certainly could account for this, it seems Tyrannosaurs didn't get particularly large until long after the North American Carcharodontosaurs went extinct. A similar story unfolds in South America, where Megaraptorans and Abelisaurids didn't present multi-ton members like Maipe and Abelisaurus until after the Carcharodontosaurs went extinct. While on Earth, it appears from albeit very few data points that Carnosaurs prevented the evolution of large theropods of other clades, the story was different in Campanian of Chimere. Megaraptorans, Abelisaurids, and Tyrannosaurs all came in at much greater sizes than the cardinals were used to dealing with. Maybe not large enough to directly confront, but certainly more of an issue than the tropical basal Megaraptorans, Abelisaurids, and Coelophosaurs of the previous dynasty all remained under half a ton for the most part. This abundance of new competition took its toll. Adults were fine, sure, but young cardinals now had their work cut out for them until they were around 12 years old, and that's a long time to be under constant stress and competitive pressure. They also had a new suite of prey that the new competition was much more used to hunting. It wasn't long before the cardinals were reduced to species specialized in sauropods. A few million years earlier, this specialization would have been well worth the effort. However, this focus didn't carry the benefits it had in dynasties past, as the cast of prey was changing too. During the more arid ages of Chimere's past, sauropods reigned supreme. They were seasonal bursts of flora for sauropods to kickstart their growth, and in the dry seasons, being huge meant that they could very efficiently travel between food sources. Smaller animals simply aren't as efficient in migration. In the golden age of floral biomass, thanks to the heat and humidity, being big was no longer a game changer. Also, the floral landscape was changing. Flowering plants weren't new to Chimere. Indeed, angiosperms were introduced in the previous dynasty, but they were little more than a footnote. Now they accounted for as much as half the plants found in some formations. Sauropods can digest just about any vegetation, but the horsetails and other gymnosperms that ferment in high productivity in their massive guts are heavily favored. So now there was an opening for an herbivore preferring these new plants, and didn't need to be especially large, since food was everywhere and the most abundant predators were less than half the size. It paid instead to match their numbers game. This opening was rapidly occupied by the hadrosaurs. As Eurasia and North America were periodically connected during the late Cretaceous, it is difficult to say where these harvests took place. However, both Lambeosaurines and Saurolophines were introduced and thrived at this time. Within the geological blink of an eye, herds of large hadrosaurs became the most abundant megafauna. Sauropods were still present and in many regions quite successful, but they were vastly outnumbered by the hadrosaurs. Ceratopsids were another clade that thrived in Nekar and Hyrule. On Earth, this was primarily a radiation endemic to North America, with only Sinoceratops being found briefly in Asia. Similarly, they appear to have had limited range of success in Chimere. Where they thrived, which was in temperate and subtropical Nekar and western Hyrule, they were especially successful. In some formations, they are by far the most abundant catalogued vertebrate fossils, though it must be said this is likely a result of preservation and collection bias, not to mention that they seem to have favored the sort of slow-moving waterways which are excellent for preservation. There were ample wetlands and swamp forests at this time, so plenty of habitat for big herbivores that liked being nearby waterways in which to retreat. Hiding in shallow waters is an excellent defense when you can sink and have horns, and your predators float and have exposed bellies after all. While there were tropical wetlands, it seems generally ceratopsids didn't like it too hot, so they seem to have not spread to the northern half of the continent like the hadrosaurs did. A relative of ceratopsids, the pachycephalosaurs, were also conclusively introduced to Chimere at this time. There are some possible basal pachycephalosaurs from previous dynasties, but these were the first definitive members of the group which are found. While some Maastrichtian pachycephalosaurs got quite large, all Chimeran pachycephalosaurs at this dynasty were 100 pounds or less. Oviraptorosaurs and ornithomimosaurs were also brought from Laurasia and thrived in numerous habitats. There was also competition in the old titans in the form of new titanosaurs. The exact phylogeny of these titans in the previous dynasty is disputed, as they were harvested quite basal and had developed into their own endemic clades by this point, with the most abundant being the Velocititans, so named not for their raw speed, but in reference to their fast growth. However, we do know these new titans were Saltosaurs and other Lithostrosians. The armor that these titans, many of them at least, seem to have possessed, had defensive benefits, especially while young, but it appears perhaps the main benefit was nutrient and mineral storage, which would have helped keep growing when times were tough. Not that important in this time of plenty, but it would be a very useful trait down the road. It is a trait which not only protects modern titans in the known world from many mammal predators in their youth, it also helps them make the treacherous journey from Hyrule to the known world 12 million years ago. Armored dinosaurs in the known world were an exception to this general turnover. Being more heavily armored than the incoming parankylosaurs, nodosaurs, and ankylosaurs seems to have benefited the old guard, and the acrosaurs persisted in abundance. It could also be that having a more general diet made this lineage not as impacted by the floral turnover as some other native clades were. Whatever the reason, while there are parankylosaurs, nodosaurs, and ankylosaurs in many formations, the acrosaurs are by far the most successful in Nekar and Hyrule at this time. It seems there were a few status quos, but nothing lasted terribly long. Shortly after the harvest spikes, there were consistently a Carcharodontosaur as the largest predators, a range of Tyrannosaurs, Megaraptorans, and Abelisaurids as their vassals, and many Dromaeosaurs and young Megatheropods in their fringes, but it is very difficult to tell if these were niches in rotation from a few harvests, as we see in the known world within the past 15 million years of modern times, or if they were native clades evolving. Only the Carcharodontosaurs are known to be consistent. While they weren't strictly specialized in titanosaurs, as evidenced by cark tooth marks matching cardinals on both hadrosaurs and ceratopsids, they were most abundant in the titan forests and rare in the closed forests and fern prairies that occupied in the previous dynasty. The same could be said of the herbivores. Throughout these 15 million years, there was a lot of turnover, but it's hard to say if they came from new harvests or simply radiations of similar taxa. The lambeosaurians can be a bit more confidently placed as their crests are often distinct, but in some cases it's not so illustrative. Hypacrosaurus and Corythosaurus, for example, look extremely similar but are confidently assigned to distinct genera, so it's possible, from the taxa found in Chimere, at the time only superficially resembled such genera as Corythosaurus, Parasaurolophus, and Lambeosaurus. Fossils of large titanosaurs have always been a rare find. The scarce remains of the old Velocititan clade are often quite difficult to distinguish from the new titanosaurs like Puertosaurus and Dreadnoughtus, so it can be hard to say which clade was dominant throughout this era. It can be more confidently said that while these two clades vied, the saltosaurs remained generally small. If there's any part of the Red Spring that can be considered a dynasty, it was the last stretch, perhaps lasting as much as 8 million years, which had minimal harvest. By this time, the climate was warm and stable, indeed quite productive on land. If there was a terrestrial harvest, the animals seem to have either taken a niche of a related animal or disappeared. Not a lot of novel adaptations occurred at this time. Over this period, Daspletosaurs presented their contender for giant apex predator in the form of Alpha Tyrannus. This giant theropod could reach 7 tons. Not as large as the cardinals in the Titan forests, but much more common. It wasn't quite as overpowered as T-Rex, but it had a tremendously powerful bite. The second largest tyrannosaur at this time, Gigantolalaps, is of disputed origin. As its name suggests, many argue for it being descended from an Appalachian tyrant lineage. None have been confirmed from Chimere's fossil record at this time, as little is known from our own formations preluding this taxon, so we can't fill in many gaps either. Gigantolalaps was, at 5 tons, smaller than Alpha Tyrannus, yet more abundant. It has been proposed that they were specialized in hadrosaurs while the more robust Alpha Tyrannus preferred ceratopsids, but isotopic analysis suggests that there was enough variation between specimens that the picture is likely more complex than such simple partitioning. The most abundant large theropods still belong to the Albertosaurs, which seem to have leaned into social hunting. Claronomiogorgon was a genus thriving throughout Kyrule and Nikar at this time. They generally range between 2 and 3 tons, but many have been found in groups of varying ages. Megaraptorans and Abelisaurids still found in the later years of the Red Spring, but usually in closed forests and wetlands or prairies respectively. The 2 Abelisaurid clades seen in modern Kyrule with a wetland and prairie specialist both had their origins at this time. Megaraptorans seem to have had success early in the dynasty, but it appears the Gorgons generally outcompeted them. Neither Megaraptorans or Abelisaurids exceeded 2 tons in these later years. While it was an age of prosperity for the land, the oceans of this era were surprisingly impoverished. The ichthyosaurs and other marine reptiles had low populations and larger species went extinct, likely as a response to drop in game fish and cephalopod populations. It is unknown why the oceans were hit so hard while the land was at its peak biodiversity and biomass, but undersea volcanism, especially as Arvel was breaking away from the southern continent, and a general cutoff of currents, cycling waters between climate zones, have been suggested. Whatever the reasons, while mosasaurs were approaching their zenith on Earth and oceans were thriving, the marine habitats of Chimere were at their lowest since the Ice Ages. The suffering of the seas was a prelude to similar suffering on land. Around 68 million years ago, the climate quickly became arid. Though the cause of this rapid shift is unknown, it is probably a combination of continental drift impacting wind and water currents, volcanism, and a proposed reduction in the planet's axial tilt, making warm regions hotter and cool latitudes colder. An extraterrestrial impact has been proposed, but this was in the wake of such a proposal for our planet and hasn't had any evidence outside of core samples, which can also be explained by volcanism. Regardless of the exact cause, a shift from a humid climate to cool and arid was swift. Many of the ceratopsids and hadrosaurs, reliant on the abundance of foliage and wetland habitat, went extinct, and their abundance of large theropods followed suit. There were still members of each clade, but the impact was certainly noticeable. Sauropods took their lumps, but it seems they were much better able to pivot to a seasonal fluctuation of feast and famine. Another harvest was triggered following this loss of biomass and biodiversity, and as far as is presently known, it was a single harvest from late Maastrichtian Asia. Many of these animals were pre-adapted to an arid climate, so thrived in rapid repopulation and spread. The climate recovered, but a vast majority of megafauna were already established from this harvest, especially in Nikkar and western Kyrule. The residents were still found in some capacity, but the newcomers now made up a majority. Ceratopsids were perhaps the most successful of the old guard, as there wasn't an abundance of newcoming competition for the wetlands, and titans and carcharodontosaurs of the old guard held true in the forests as they returned, but the hadrosaurs and tyrannosaurs were largely replaced by Asian saurophines and tarbosaurs and alioramines respectively. Though similar in broad strokes, with tyrannosaurs as generally the top predator and a mix of ceratopsids, hadrosaurs, and sauropods as the most abundant megafaunal herbivores, this new age marked the beginning of a new golden age of stability. This was the Tyrant Dynasty. This marks the end of this series. I do have an episode on the Tyrant Dynasty with a focus more on the tyrannosaurs and their ecology than a wider lens I've taken with this series. Hope y'all have enjoyed this month of the Mesozoic. Cheers to Garrick for sponsoring this episode. Was very excited to have it be a continuous narrative. It's been great to see the reception of the past few episodes in the series has reaffirmed my plans to make a book going into detail of the harvests and dynasties. This book would be able to go into a whole lot more detail than I'm able to get into the format of these episodes. As longtime viewers of the channel may have noticed, I worked with a lot of old abandoned designs into these dynasties. When I first designed the Uktyan and Zentaur back in high school, they were quadrupedal theropods and a giant Rauisuchian, respectively. The Kurujaku was at one point a giant Spinosaur, which I also recreated for the third dynasty. Just as the giant tyrannosaurs of the Tyrant Dynasty were abandoned concepts for modern Chimere, so too were the derived polar Dilophosaurs, oversized diplodocoids, and other huge animals we've met this month. This series is as much a journey through Chimere's prehistory as it is a journey through my sketchbooks of this project, going back 20 years come October. I've planned for the release of my next anthology, coinciding roughly with the 20-year anniversary of when I first drew a map of Picardia, which kicked off this project, but I'll have to do something big for the channel as well. Thanks again to Garrick for sponsoring this episode. He has sponsored a whole lot of episodes for this year, and possibly a couple going into next, depending on how my schedule pans out, but I am extremely excited for a lot of what's to come, and for the opportunity to do this series, with the help of JRX for that first Dynasty episode, of course. Thanks to my Patreon patrons, Without your support, I couldn't devote my time to this project and its related works. Link above if you're able and interested in supporting Chimere. Thanks again so much to Garrick for this sponsorship, and thank you for watching. Cheers, folks!